Oh, good morning. István Tóth, I'm directing Tárki Social Research Institute. First of all, I would like to wish happy International Women's Day to all women globally, Europe, Hungary, Budapest, and in this room as well. This is an event which is organized by Tarki in its Work in Progress series. It's a regular seminar where we share ideas, discuss papers, and we sometimes inform of full papers, sometimes inform of just half-ready papers. It's regularly Tarki and friends who appear on both sides as presenters and the audience as well. The aim of this seminar series is to have a scholarly exchange of issues that are important for us. Today is a very special occasion as we have the opportunity to discuss a book which is truly remarkable at the level of the world science, titled Visions of Inequality from the French Revolution to the End of the Cold War. The book here will be presented by the author, to whom I am very grateful that he accepted our invitation to Budapest. Let me introduce you to Professor Milanovic, who is a senior scholar at the Stone Center on Socio-Economic Inequality. He obtained his PhD in economics from the University of Belgrade with a dissertation on income inequality in Yugoslavia. He served as a lead economist in World Bank Research Department for almost 20 years, and a senior associate at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in Washington. He has held teaching appointments in University of Maryland and Johns Hopkins University, and currently he is also a visiting professor at the International Inequality Institute at the London School of Economics and Political Science. His books include many worldwide known books, bestsellers, all around the world, the haves and the have-nots, global inequality, and capitalism alone. And the latter one also appeared in Hungarian if you want to check it or read it. These are all receiving remarkable receptions in universities, research cycles, policy debates, and even everyday discussions. Visions of Inequality, the book which is discussed today, is on the best-selling list of the Harvard University Press and received the title of being the Financial Times Book of the Year last year. His presentation will be discussed by three distinguished speakers: Andrea Brandolini, who is with us on the online, Éva Fodor, who is here with us in person, and Nolan, who is with us also online. I will introduce them when they start speaking. And after that, when the comments will be finished, then we will open the discussion for, I think we will have something like an hour for an open discussion. So please prepare your notes and formulate your questions if you want. I think Professor Milanovic will be happy to answer. So can I now ask Branko, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much, István. First of course, I would like to thank István and Tarki for inviting me to Budapest. It's really always a pleasure to be here. And then, of course, I would like to thank Eva, Andrea, and Brian for having accepted to actually comment on the book. So let me say, István has already mentioned the title of the book, Visions of Inequality. What is the objective of the book? So let me, well, before I go to the line, well, the objective of the book is actually to study how key economic authors have looked at inequality. As you will see in a minute, this is not easy because they don't really study income inequality as we sort of know it. They actually do much more of a study of functional income inequality, what economists call functional, which is inequality between capital, labor, and land. In other words, between the owners of capital, owners of labor power, and land. And similarly, they don't have like a subtitle, you would say section, which would be about, about income inequality or income distribution. So it's really basically trying to understand the logic and, of course, to follow the text of the key authors. Now, who are the key authors? Actually, this is an old slide, so I didn't put Quesnay here in the beginning. He's the first author in the book, François Quesnay, who wrote before the French Revolution and who is was considered like the founder of political economy with Adam Smith, but also the founder of the physiocratic movement in France. So here you have the list of, I think, important writers in income distribution. I start with Smith, who is in the book, obviously Ricardo, Marx, all three of them are in the book, then Pareto as well. You see the dates. Actually, the dates are the year of birth, then the year when the most important work was done. Actually, this is the blue dot. For example, in Marx, it would be 1867, the publication of Capital. For Ricardo, 1817, the publication of the Principles of Political Economy. And then I continue with Pareto, as I mentioned. Let me just go. After Pareto, the next one is Kuznets. This was, as I said, slide that I used in my class. And then you see this part there. I put Dalton and Gini because it was a part, it was the time of the early 20th century where really methodological developments were much more important than really the study of income distribution per se. Then we come to Kuznets, who is in the book. I also put there, as I said in my class, I teach Tinbergen, but he's not. I didn't include him in the book. And then towards the end, there are, Tony Atkinson and Thomas Piketty. Piketty is the only one, obviously, who is alive. Atkinson, fortunately, passed away in 2017. But this is the part of the book that is already after Tony Atkinson. Actually, that part of the book is not discussed in the book. I have a little bit in the epilogue, but as the book title says, it really ends with the end of the Cold War. So de facto, the end point is 99. Already here, I mentioned, of course, the main sort of ways that income inequality was looked upon. As I already said, up to Pareto, you have really essentially inequality between classes, social classes. In Quesnay, it's moreover inequality between the legally defined classes. And in Quesnay's case, it's really a replica of the legal position in France before the revolution. After that, obviously, with Smith, Ricardo, and Marx, the definitions are based on the ownership of the means of production. Then Pareto comes with interpersonal inequality, as I mentioned already, methodology, and then continues with Kuznets with of course, urban versus rural or manufacturing versus agriculture. So, as I said, the objective is to chart the evolution of thinking on income distribution during the past 2 centuries. And then to discuss why inequality studies went into what I call the eclipse after the 1960s approximately. And also that chapter, which is chapter 7, I'm sure is very controversial. I will mention it very briefly in the presentation, but I would actually just indicate the reason why it went into an eclipse. The chapter itself is much longer and deals with different people, including a group that I could not include in the book as sufficiently as I wish I could because of my own lack of knowledge. And this is really structuralist and dependencia theorists who I believe are very important. Samir Amin is somebody who has a place in the book, but I think I would have I should have maybe given more place to Samir Amin at the end. And then I argue in that chapter when I discuss the most recent developments in rather negative light. I do that because I propose what I think is are integrative studies of income distribution, or call it comprehensive, whatever you want to call it, which I think should have a very clear narrative, a theory, and empirical verification. It doesn't seem to be very much. It seems to be like commonsensical, but it is true that when you look at what really was done over the period of the eclipse, you'll find extremely theoretical studies, which are, in my opinion, are totally unrelated to reality, or you find uber empirical studies without much theory, and you often really don't even have a very clear narrative. Yeah, when I say the clear narrative, I mean by that it is something that should be explained fairly simply, and that should be the guiding principle of each author. And in each of the 6 authors that I have in the book, I think there is a very clear narrative that they have, and I think they do have theory. And they obviously have much less in terms of empirical verification, because in those days, of course, the data on income distribution were really not available. And if you look at my book, every chapter starts with a description of the author, his life, some interesting details, and then goes into income distribution and income inequality at the time of the author in the country where he's studying. So that basically means for Smith and Ricardo, UK inequality, for Marx as well, but I also included inequality in Germany, and then for Pareto, inequality in France, although it could have been inequality in Italy as well, and Kuznets in the US. So then you can really very easily see how much more we know about inequality in the 19th century England or Scotland today than for example, Adam Smith or Ricardo. With Marx, you already see much more empirical detail, but of course, much less than what we know today. So let me then go, actually, I would really like to focus on Smith and Marx. I think they're actually the most important authors also in the book. Now, I did not, when I started writing about Smith, I did not really plan, and I've read Wealth of Nations many years ago and reread it and so on, and I didn't really want to address the question of the so-called the Adam Smith question. Are there 2 Adam Smith? I didn't plan at all addressing. But as I was reading and rereading, the point became very, very clear to me that from the point of view of income distribution, there is really a world of difference between the theory of moral sentiments and the Wealth of Nations. And the key difference is the following. In the theory of moral sentiments, Smith takes the hierarchy essentially as given. He makes fun of the rich people. He actually talks about their frivolity, being fatuous, being vain, being to some extent indolent. But he never questions their right to be on the top. He never questions even the way they have acquired wealth. And when you move to the world of the Wealth of Nations, which in principle some economists believe is a tougher world, more right-wing world, it's the very opposite. And I will show that the quotes. An enormous amount of attack on the way that the rich have acquired wealth, I think in some sense is more striking and stronger even than Marx's own sort of criticism of primitive accumulation. So these are 2 different worlds. And from the point of view of somebody who studies income distribution, it seems to me that the Wealth of Nations is much more leftist, if you will, in the sense that it questions the way that the rich people have come to power. So let me then stop for that for a minute, because I'll go back. But I would simply, the second point, which is here, is that let us look at what Adam Smith sees as the evolution of these 3 shares of the real wage, or the evolution of their absolute amounts, rather, real wage, profits, and rent, because that would be quite important too. So what he says is that actually with development, with advancement of society, he believes that the real wage will go up. So that there is no much doubt about that. This is in the entire, 5 books of the Wealth of Nations. And of course, countries are really ranked by the level of development of commercial society. And it's totally correlated, practically entirely correlated with real wage. On the top, it's true of the real wage, according to Smith, is North American colonies and the Netherlands. Then England comes next, Scotland, France, and then Poland, Portugal, and so forth. So there is no doubt that actually that's what we call GDP per capita and real wage are linked. Now, the land rent, according to Smith, would also increase in the process of development, because there is a greater demand for food as the population increases, and a greater demand for the products of the earth, mining, cotton, and so forth. No, the only factoral income that would go down in the advancement of society is profits. And why? Because there is greater abundance of what Adam Smith calls stock, which means capital. So that's the same idea, which then we will see later also in Ricardo, well, similar idea to Ricardo and to Marx, is really the profit rate would go down. Now, it would have an important, in my opinion, important implication. When Adam Smith speaks of the different social, organized groups, be it church, organized religion, labor, government, or employers' associations, he is most critical about the employers, or what he calls masters, or what we would call capitalists, because he says their interest runs counter to the public interest, because their incomes would go down with the advancement of society. Consequently, they should not be listened uncritically by the government. So I think it's very important, and I have not seen this before, it's very important to draw Adam Smith's negative, how should I say, skeptical view about employers' association from his view about the evolution of factor shares in the more advanced society. So they're really, I've said too many things here, but they're really, I think, 2 points which are important in my opinion in the chapter on Smith. First, the distinction between theory of moral sentiments and the wealth of nations. And secondly, the development of factor shares, and from that development, drawing the line to what association or what professional group has to be looked most with the greatest skepticism when it comes to their advice. So let me go to I actually didn't want to go to Ricardo now because I wanted really to focus on Smith. I said the theory of moral sentiments is often thought, I think generally because of influence of Amartya Sen, to be much softer and light, nicer in some sense. And the leftist view has sort of become in the 20th century and the latter part of the 20th century and early 21st century to be questioning and to believe that if you have the grounding principle, like in the theory of moral sentiments, to be empathy, it has to be more leftist than if your grounding principle is self-interest and growth, which is definitely the case in the wealth of nations. And as I was saying before, I don't think this is true, actually. The very opposite, in my opinion, is true. In the matters of distribution, theory of moral sentiments is actually much harsher. And it is harsher because I think also when the original theory of moral sentiments was written, Adam Smith just got his job. He was a moral philosopher. He basically had to create a work where manifest inequalities, obvious inequalities, inequities between people had somehow to be justified through the greater benevolence of the great maker. So in other words, there is this, I would say, tension or the attempt to disregard actual differences in income and wealth between people and to claim that differences in underlying happiness are much less. And then the divine will is seen in that the God did not forget the poor people. They're actually not very much unhappier than the rich people. They have greater security. They, as he says, they can actually send themselves on the road, like, you know, they have no worries. But the kings are very much worried. They can be overthrown. They could be killed. So the attempt to equalize happiness between different groups and thereby to justify the divine providence, it's very strong in the theory of moral sentiments. And sometimes it becomes quite reactionary, or it is, if we want to call it, Panglossian. But none of that would be present in the wealth of nations, which is very, very tough and very realistic. So that was why I believe that from the point of view of income distribution, the wealth of nations is much harder, but much more leftist. And this is, I think, one of the objectives. The rich are derided for their behavior in the theory of moral sentiments. spending patterns. It's very similar to Veblen's theory of the leisure class. It's, theory of the leisure class is kind of interesting to read, but really there is no questioning that these people who are wasting money should be there. And likewise in the theory of moral sentiments. And it really looks, as I said, very often very conservative. He has a problem with Van de Ville, an obvious problem. He calls it pernicious system. But the problem was that Van de Ville actually says that what we see as the private vices eventually, through basically invisible hand, not of course in those terms, lead to the public virtue. And it is very difficult for Adam Smith to accept that. I've actually, after having written the book and reading stuff, I've come to the conclusion, and this is, people laugh when I say that, I think the theory of moral sentiments is a job market paper. It's a paper that he had to write then. But as he became older and he became more disillusioned and he became tougher, he wrote The Wealth of Nations. And that's why I think The Wealth of Nations for us is a much more important and also a stronger work. As I said, it is a work of self-interest, self-realism, stern realism and self-interest in the wealth of nations. And it was built, as George Siegel said, on the granite of self-interest, not on altruism and empathy. But I will already explain before why I believe that, strictly speaking, from our perspective, from my perspective, it was actually a much more leftist work. You have the statements, as one that I'm not going to read here, but that criticizes laws on food and religion, or as both being based on popular prejudice and consequently bad. So you have here very clear in that statement when he talks about religion, how the government has to follow popular prejudice in sort of fostering different types of religions. It's really criticism of religion. And that criticism continues. The use of irony when he says, I've never, if you look at the second quote here, of the Quakers in Pennsylvania, they have released the slaves, which of course may satisfy us that their number, the slaves, cannot be very great. Obviously, the famous quote that he has never known much good being done by people who affect to trade for public interest. This is the irony, this cynicism sometimes is very present, but that cynicism then, and irony, it moves, let me just move to these quotes, moves to the incomes of the rich. And in my book, I cannot remember what page it is, but I intentionally put about 5 different ways that are dispersed, obviously, in The Wealth of Nations, about the way that the rich, according to Smith, have acquired wealth. And I intentionally put only one word in the title for each of them, and then the whole quote. And what are these ways? Plunder, colonialism, collusion, monopoly, slavery. It's absolutely sort of striking when you put them together. And I actually said to the editor, I want to keep it like that because it's actually like a machine, rapid fire. It's like a machine gun. It's like one bullet after another. As I said, they are dispersed in Adam Smith. They are not there. And then the merchant companies. It is well known that he was, of course, had extremely negative view of the East India Company. And, when he says that these are the people who are totally indifferent, lest even the country that they are ruling should disappear. Because once they have withdrawn their money, they couldn't care less what happens to India, to the country that they are ruling. Or then he, of course, talks very tough here, as you can see, merchant republics of Venice, Genoa, and Pisa, and their role in the Crusades. And when he calls the Crusades the greatest folly that ever befell the mankind. So it is you look at the trading companies that come really for a permanent opprobrium in Smith, and it's not accidental. So let me then finish with it. Maybe I'm already taking too much time for Smith, but the bottom line is, it says here, the rule by the rich is not in the social interest. And it's not in the social interest for the reasons that I mentioned before, is that they actually they are the group of people whose interest, which is profit, is running counter to the advancement of society, because the profit would decline, according to Smith, in the advancement of society. And you see the quotes here, but the mean rapacity of the wealthy, the monopolizing spirit of the merchants, and so on, should never be preventing from disturbing the tranquility of anybody by themselves. The government should not support associations of capitalists at all, and cannot ban them, but it should not support them. And what was also interesting, he says, of course, they have the advantage of smaller size and the ability to coordinate, which of course labor doesn't have, because labor is dispersed and there are many people. But capitalists are few in number. They can coordinate well, as the famous statement also says. They always meet in order to basically plot against the public interest, and in order to, of course, improve their own position. So they have that advantage, and moreover, it's actually interesting when he looks at the three groups of people, like capitalists, workers, and landlords. He says workers are uneducated, and they don't have access to power, and they cannot coordinate because there are too many of them. Landlords are indolent, so they don't have an influence of the government policy because they are indolent. But employers are handling sophistry and casuistry very well. So thereby, they are more sort of, how should I say, they're more powerful, and consequently, we have to actually look at them much more carefully. So let me then move to, this is actually a nice slide, I forgot about that. When you count the number of times that God or different terms which are related to God, divine, providence, great maker, appear in the Theory of Moral Sentiments and the Wealth of Nations, it is also striking. Theory of Moral Sentiments has almost 150 mentions of God, and in a size which is 1/3 of the Wealth of Nations. Now, how many times does God appear in the Wealth of Nations? It's not there. It's 6 times. It doesn't appear there. It is really a very different work. So this is for Adam Smith. The bottom line, in my opinion, first, the Theory of Moral Sentiments is basically theological, work which tries to justify the state of affairs as being observed. The Wealth of Nations is a realistic work which questions all associations, whether it is government, trade unions, they didn't exist in those time, but unions of workers, employers, or organized religion, and comes down the most strongly on the organized capital. That would be, in my opinion, and that coming down strongly on organized capital is because of the way that the wealth was acquired, and because profit rates would go down in the development of society. Now, I think I should took too much time with Smith. Let me just go more quickly with Marx, and then I'll just conclude with chapter 7, 2 or 3 sentences. Marx, what I think actually, what is the contribution of the chapter is the following. Everybody knows, who has ever read any introduction of Marx, that Marx is being considered of having a theory of income distribution, which is the following. Immiseration of labor, which means reduction of real wages as the society develops, and the concentration of capital in the hands of the fewer people. Let's put these two things together from the income distribution side, that it simply means there will be increased inequality. There will be fewer and fewer people, there will be greater polarization. And the idea, for example, Henry Grossman had that very clearly. The idea was this will be the secular increase in income inequality. Superimposed on that, you have crisis of overproduction. And at one point, you would have such contradictions in the system that there will be the so-called breakdown theory. Now, I think that this is, how should I say, it's not entirely an accurate reading of Marx, because you do have some textual evidence, but that textual evidence is very weak, and I believe that it is in contradiction with the essential ideas that Marx had. Not that I claim that Marx had a theory of income distribution. I would actually show in a minute that there is no, in my opinion, deterministic theory. But I believe that immiseration theory is not the only acceptable theory that we can draw from Marx. And in my opinion, it's actually less acceptable than the alternative. Now, the alternative one starts from the following fact. First, Marx did not believe in the iron law wages. And that we know. He has rejected Lassalle. He actually thought it was not his at all. He actually makes even fun of that. And what did Marx think about wages? So because I want to start the same way that I did with immiseration and concentration of capital. Let's start with wages first. First of all, there is obviously complex and simple labor in Marx. Consequently, there is wage inequality by definition at any point in time. Secondly, Marx, in a number of instances, shows the difference in real wage between societies at different level of development. There is a very nice table where he has England on top, he has Prussia and Austria next, and then second Prussia and Austria next, and then Russia on the bottom. So the ratio in nominal wages is 5-1 between England and Russia. In real wages, probably 3-1, because obviously the price level in England was higher probably than in Russia. So he's very much aware. He writes about wages being higher in more developed countries. He says the wage rate is determined not only by physiological needs, but by historical needs. So there is this moral historical dimension to the wage. Moreover, and that's I think very important, for Marx, needs are historically determined. And when he says in a very poor society, the needs are very limited because the society is poor. Because when you are poor, you're not going to have the need for the cell phone or the internet because it doesn't exist. Consequently, both needs and real wage are historical categories. If they are historical categories, there is, I think, very strong argument to say that the wage would rise, real wage, in the process of development. Moreover, when we have these quotes, couple of quotes about immiseration, they are from the Communist Manifesto written when Marx was 29 years old, and we practically did not study political economy. So really, it is a very selective choice on that. Consequently, what I actually argue is that, well, I've already said all of this, actually, that the real wages were likely to increase with development. I will skip Marx's very interesting point that with increased organic composition of capital, or what we call greater technological development, you would have this skilling of labor, which is similar to Adam Smith. With this, I'm now going to a slightly different topic, but Adam Smith actually, when he speaks of workers, he actually said workers are very often stupid, and they're stupid in places and countries at the lowest level where there is greater division of labor. So, you know, that was interesting. Adam Smith is actually, he is the originator of the idea of division of labor, creating, actually broadening the market and creating development. And he says that division of labor leads to actually de-skilling, because people don't have time and energy except for the tasks that they are given. In Marx, a very similar idea that the organic composition of capital, which with increased organic composition of capital, you have de-skilling of labor. And one should not, maybe I should not go to this. One should not confuse, I think, the increased real wage in Marx with the decline in the share of labor. This is exactly what is happening now. We have, for example, in Western Europe, we have increased real wages in the last 20 years, but shrinking capital share. So there are three things there in Marx, which I think exist simultaneously, and that's one of the points of the chapter. Increased real wage, decline labor share, and the decline of rate of profit, despite the fact that the profit share is up. Simply, the rate of profit goes down because there is much more capital. And although the capital share is increased, there is the rate of return on a unit of capital is less. And these are, except for the third one, which I think we can argue that has not gone down, but clearly the labor share has gone down over the last 30 years in practically most countries, and the real wage has increased. So this is the, I think, the two developments which are consistent with Marx's idea. No, I've already mentioned this, but I don't want to expand this. It's like the endless topic of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. As you know, thousands of pages have been written on that. I take it as, I think, a reasonably accurate description in Marx. I take it as sort of, I accept that there could be, within the Marxist system, there could be a secular decline in the rate of profit. This is the formula. Then essentially, the whole point is whether the surplus rate or surplus value can increase at the same rate as the organic composition of capital. Now, organic composition of capital has no upper bound. You can have billions of capital per unit of labor, and rate of surplus value, actually, if you look over, I mean, at the 8 hours or 10 hours of work, it does have some limit. But I will not go into that. I think actually you know, 3 chapters on that, well, there are 60 or maybe 60 to 70 pages have been sort of studied and restudied for millions of times. And of course, there are offsetting factors. This is discussed in the book. I will skip that. The offsetting factors, just to mention one, there are first 6 offsetting factors that Marx lists. I think actually about only 2 of them make sense. I think some are really made up. This is clearly written in a rush. Obviously, that was edited in the 3rd volume by Engels. And then there is, of course, increased concentration of capital income, which is actually, I think, totally consistent with Marx's own thinking. And then there is the role of the reserve army of labor on the wage side, which permanently puts the pressure on the real wage. So what is the bottom line, in my opinion, for Marx is the following one. We have both equality reducing and equality increasing factors. Equality reducing factors are the ones that I already mentioned, tendency of the profit rate to go down, and the increase in real wage. If I put these two together, obviously I get a reduction in inequality. But there are inequality increasing factors. The crisis, which is quite interesting, the creative destruction, are increasing profit rate because they destroy, profit rate is high profit over K capital. What does the crisis do? It destroys capital. Consequently, the denominator becomes smaller and the profit rate goes up. So it's actually an inequality increasing force. Expansion to the new areas of production, that's basically like Rosa Luxemburg did it, but except that I think new areas of production is broader than simply new countries or new sort of areas physically in the land area. New areas of production can be anything, like when you create new goods, as we are now witnessing, like every day, there is a new product. Not only new product physically, but actually commodification of things. I was recently discussing the fact that actually people like Trump sell their names. So this is a new commodity. That commodity did not exist 50 years ago. And then concentration of capital, which I already mentioned. What are the factors on the labor side which push inequality up? The pressure of the reserve army of labor, we already know that, and this killing of labor. This killing of labor as well reduces the real wage rate and consequently increases inequality. The last slide on Marx is actually the summary. You have, in my opinion, 4 different, you have 2 theories that can be textually based on Marx. One is the breakdown scenario, which I already explained, and the other one is the optimistic scenario with increased real wage and the decrease in the rate of profit. I think both of them can be textually defended by recourse to Marx. But then you can start combining, and these 2 other, polarized society and regressive society, are not in Marx, but they are easily obtainable by combination. The polarized society would be a society with a secular increase in the wage rate and concentration of capital, essentially the society of the top 1%, if you will. So that would be, as you can see, it's a combination. Wage goes up, capital gets concentrated. So one element from the increased inequality, one element from the decreased inequality. And the final one is the regressive society. It's immiseration of labor and a secular decline in profits. Now, what's interesting there, that society essentially is a society with a reduction in the value added. Because if you have reduction in real wages, and if you have reduction in profits, and the two of them are value added, or the net product, obviously you have a reduction in net value added. So I put here, I mean, I don't think it's in the book, but for example, Argentina could be one example of that society. The essential point, as one of my referees said, the essential point is that Marx cannot be seen as a Victorian determinist in the matters of income distribution. We have to see him as a writer where the contingency of capitalist development can lead to various sort of combinations of what happens to profit and the real wage. And these are the four, I think, alternative four possibilities, and we can actually play with modern societies into which category they might fall. So that would be, I think, for Marx, and as I said before, I will just say 2 or 3 sentences about chapter 7. And actually, basically, before the trajectory of income distribution, what we can see in the book and what became very clear to me as I was writing it, is essentially that you move, it is really like a picture, like a movie. You start from legally defined social classes, you go under Smith, Ricardo, and Marx into the classes defined by the relationship to the means of production. You move to Pareto, where the elite matters, and the what we can call top 1% matters. To Kuznets, where actually it was agriculture versus industry, manufacturing, agriculture versus manufacturing, rural versus urban areas. And finally, we come, the Kuznets is then at the antechamber of the eclipse, because neither class nor elite longer matter, and we move with neoclassical world to the optimizing agents, where actually even the type of assets that you have doesn't matter, because the assets are written as subscripts. You own the J subscript, I own L subscript, so I, J, K, L. All individuals are de facto the same, regardless of the power relationship, regardless of the assets they own, regardless whether they're in the top 1% or top 5% or the bottom. And that's basically the time of the eclipse. And I think actually the time of the eclipse in the West was led by, I think, 3 factors of unequal importance. The first factor is a political factor, where I think clearly as the gravity of economic studies moved from Europe to the United States, where class was always less, how should I say, perceived as less important, might not have been less important, but was perceived. At the time of the Cold War, the argument was essentially, to put it very brutally, if you claim, meaning the Soviet Union, that you don't have capitalist class, neither do we. And essentially, we are also a classless society like you claim to be, we are too. Secondly, neoclassical developments which led to this formalization of the representative agent and to the disregard of the elite and the class was the second development. And the third development was the funding of research by the rich. So these are the things which, in my opinion, led to the eclipse in the West. The things which led to the eclipse in the East, which are the first 2 sections of chapter 7, are similar. First, capitalist class was actually disappeared because of nationalization, and it became certainly much less important. Secondly, there was a political dictatorship which actually limited and prevented the study of income distribution and the study of any class, because it was presumably a classless society. And the third point was really much lower accessibility and availability of data. So we have really both in the East, in communist countries, and in the West, in capitalist countries, partly determined political attempt to disregard studies of income distribution, and certainly not to create integrative studies, and in part due to objective developments. The objective developments mean that, for example, the capitalist class has been eliminated really in communist countries, but also that in the case of the United States, you had a period of really an expansion. The fact that I mentioned in the chapter of Kuznets, when he writes the US is producing 40% of global output, the US has had a very significant decline in inequality in the country and large increase in GDP per capita. So they were the objective factors which led to a kind of a more sunnier view or more optimistic view about the role of class, and consequently much less importance being put on the study of income distribution. So that was for that chapter, and I finally end with the epilogue, which is much more optimistic. I think we are really now back to a situation for many reasons. So I think this is all for many reasons that we will actually have. We have the return of class, we have the return of the elite, we have possibly Kuznets waves, we have studies of historical inequality thanks to social tables, and we have an increased scope where we move from nation state, as everybody has done here, to global and sort of interdependent inequalities, where actually inequality globally can influence inequality in individual countries. So we are really in a different world now, which for inequality studies is a much better world. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Now I suggest that we immediately jump to the comments. The first discussant will be Andrea Brandolini, who is Deputy Director General of the Economics and Statistical Research at the Bank of Italy. He has a very broad activity, very active scientific record. He's been sitting at the Executive Board of the Luxembourg Income Study for a while, directed with teams meeting the Luxembourg Wealth Study. He's been on the World Bank Commission on Global Poverty between 2015 to 2016. He chaired the Council on the International Association for Research and Wealth, Income and Wealth, and also sat in the Council on the Society for the Study of Economic Inequality. He's a fellow of many bodies, Human Development and Capability Association, and also the Policy Fellow of the Institute for the Study of Labor. And I don't continue because Andrea needs some time to present his comments. So Andrea, the word is yours.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Many thanks, István, and many thanks to all and to Branko for the presentation. So let me first try to share my presentation. Just a second. Okay, can you see the presentation? István, can you see the presentation? Sorry.
See. Yes,
okay.
We see.
Okay, thanks, because I cannot see you anymore. So thanks again for this invitation, and thanks to Branko for a brilliant presentation. It's always a great pleasure for me to read Branko's writing. His books are well written, deep, original, and thought-provoking. So here, however, I will stress more the missing points and some disagreements with his interpretation that for once are somewhat substantial, unlike other occasions. And let me focus on two, my view, crucial aspects of his books, what I call framing criteria of his books, Narrative and Choices. He stressed already one. He considers substantial work in inequality those who have a compelling narrative, a well-developed theory, and empirical evidence. But he also stresses a point in the introduction that he looked at, he's indifferent to normative views about inequality, meaning that he doesn't care in his presentation of the normative views of the authors he considers. He tried to focus on the positive aspects, on the positive analysis of these authors. Unlike Branko's presentation, I will focus here. I mean, the book is 300 more pages long, so I selected some chapters that I consider more important from my point of view. And I will focus more on Pareto and Kuznets and the Cold War research, more than on Smith and Marx, on which I would have much less to say. And so let me start from the point of the indifference to normative views. I mean, probably I am emphasizing too much relative to what Branko does, but just at the beginning, he makes the statement. And at face value, what Branko wants to do is to focus on authors' positive analysis, ignoring the normative views. This is important because it helps him to justify the exclusion of many authors like John Rawls or Amartya Sen and others. We could wonder whether this is entirely correct. For example, Amartya Sen's Poverty and Famine essays on entitlement and deprivation contributes to understanding how distribution works. It is not something that I would classify under the normative contribution of Amartya Sen, but that is not important. My point is that this initial claim of indifference to normative views may be somewhat misleading, suggesting that normative and positive can be separated. This is not the case in my view, as they are intrinsically intertwined. And I think that this initial claim is a bit unfortunate and possibly contradicted by many passages in Branko's book. So, for example, at page 172, it says, inevitably, in these authors, we find a connection between what they believed were desirable economic and political changes and their own work. This suggests that a neutral social science and pure scientific inquiry is not within our reach. I totally agree with Branko here. The point is that it is a bit strange to stress the indifference to normative views and then all along the book to emphasize the interaction between normative and positive. And again, I take Pareto. Pareto is a perfect example of this. And that is what Branko writes. There is a constant tension in his writing between very clear statements that the distribution cannot be changed and quasi-legalistic wordings that waters this down with careful caveats. The qualifiers are never sufficiently numerous or strong, however, to overturn the prior suggestion of the mutability of distribution. That is an important point, and the mutability of distribution is important for Pareto, but it seems to me that this implies that normative dominates positive. And again, let me turn to Kuznets on this point to make an additional point that the normative aspects is not only that matters, is not only the aspect, the normative views of the authors, but also the way in which the results are read. So, for example, when we look at Kuznets, his work on the share of upper income groups is absolutely crucial for Kuznets, and Branko to explain the downward part of the Kuznets curve. And Branko is fully correct when he stresses that Kuznets had in mind the US experience in writing in explaining his famous curve. But the political meaning of Kuznets' downward section is absolutely important, and that is stressed by Branko, and he reminds, as Arthur Burns defined this as a great social revolution of history, the sharp fall in inequality in the United States after the Second World War. Let me take the full quotation: a transformation that has been carried out peacefully and gradually. That is crucial to understand the meaning of this great social revolution of history. And let me go to what I consider an even more remarkable part of the Burns reading of Kuznets' result. It is the conclusion. this piece by Barnes was written as the annual report of the NBR, so it was a purely academic meeting. It was not a political meeting. And the conclusion of Apple Barnes was that much of today's thinking runs of necessity along military lines, but the struggle between the Western democracies and communism is basically ideological, and we must not allow its military aspect to obscure this fact. And then to strive for peace in the world, for justice in distributing incomes, for higher living standards, for security of job at home, for protection against the ravages of disease and old age, these are natural expressions of present-day culture. So I'm quoting this and referring in the other citation I briefly made, just to stress the point that indifference to normative views when in talking about income inequality is a very unfortunate term, as I said before. Now let me move to the second point that was stressed by Branko even in his introduction today. A good theory is a good contribution to income inequality is one that has narrative theory and evidence. That is brilliant, absolutely brilliant in the way it is shaped and in the way it frames the entire book. But then one needs to ask, what does theory mean? And here it is an important point because Branko has in mind a grand theory of the major forces that shape inequality change. Now, there are three aspects here that matter. First, the grand theory. Again, I stress Pareto and Kuznets. Pareto's theory of elites and Kuznets' structural change are a good example of grand theory. So major forces that change the inequality. But can they explain how total income is distributed across people? How does Pareto's theory of elites shape income distribution? And why does immutable income distribution serve it well? That is something that is more or less claimed by Branko, but not discussed. So what is the relationship between an immutable income distribution and the theory of elite? So the grand theory is important to understand income inequality, but is not enough. The second point, and that was stressed by Branko in his presentation, is that the focus is more than what shapes income inequality, is what drives inequality changes. I read here, this is not said explicitly because in the book it is something not so explicitly written. It was much more explicit in the presentation by Branko. But the interest of Branko is on forces that cause distribution to vary, not, as I said, on factors that shape distribution. This is important. I will go back to this point in a minute. And the third point is inequality of what? Throughout the book, the concern of Branko is with income, perhaps wealth. But we could discuss for long which income, and Branko is absolutely aware of all the many dimensions of income inequality that matters. But let me just remind you here one point. When Pareto discusses the immutable income distribution, he has in mind the distribution before taxes, because those are the data that he has. Because at the time redistribution was almost irrelevant. But then there is redistribution and there is a disposable income distribution. So redistribution is something that is entirely missing from the picture. And redistribution, however, is linked to what Branko calls politics, and it is important. So discussing inequality of what is absolutely important in the book. And then there are the other dimensions, power and so on, and I don't deal with those dimensions here. So one missing point, and that is, and I think something that should have been discussed more, and it is a point that, of course, Branko knows very well. He dealt with these issues in previous books, but it is the importance of measurement and how crucial it is to collect sound evidence. Pareto fully deserves the attention that Branko pays to him in the book. But it seems to me that Branko misses one point that for which Pareto is absolutely crucial, what I would say, turning point in inequality analysis. I quote here from Bresciani-Turroni's survey in Econometry in 1939, and Bresciani-Turroni concluded that the Pareto's law lacks theoretical foundation and empirical support, and Pareto conceived for the first time the idea of measuring inequality, but other indices more appropriate than alpha. This is important because Pareto paved the way to search of inequality indices, and would the Gini index that Branko and myself like so much, and many other indices, would them exist without Pareto's alpha? So that is why Pareto is crucial, much more than for the shape of the Pareto distribution. That is, after all, an important contribution, but just a statistical. But the idea of searching for an inequality index is absolutely crucial. And the second point is that Pareto was the first to make income inequality an active empirical research field. This should not be undervalued, because probably income inequality was one of the first topic for a substantial empirical research field worldwide. And that was in discussing the Pareto's law. And it is interesting that Econometrica, that was founded a few years before, published in 1939, this annual survey of statistical data, it was only the second in the series, and that was devoted to income inequality. Now, let me conclude now on the grand theory. And here is where the disagreement is very important with Branko. I quote Tony Atkinson because Tony was a friend, I was a co-author, and of course I cannot agree with Branko's judgment of Tony's contribution. I don't think that what Branko says of Tony, that he had this unrelenting criticism, is correct. And I take just an example. This is just the conclusion of a paper that Tony wrote in 1981 on the inheritance and the redistribution of wealth. It is an essay in honor of James Mead. I take this as an example of the different view. This is what I mean, grand theory versus explaining income distribution. Tony wrote, one of the principal points of this chapter has been to bring out the interrelation between different factors influencing the distribution of wealth. The influence of marriage patterns depends on how estates are divided. The impact of the division of estates depends on the process of accumulation. The conditions of aggregate equilibrium have implications for the behavior of the distribution. The inheritance of wealth may facilitate the enhancement of earnings potential. The accumulation of capital may in turn depend on earnings and expected earnings in the next generation. In view of this, it is clear that one should be cautious in drawing conclusions about the impact and policy instruments without a complete model of the distribution. I could quote many other pieces of from Tony Atkinson's. Let me just refer here to another book by Tony that would change possibly the view of Branko, that is Unequal Shares Wealth in Britain. And that is a almost 300 pages book discussing data on wealth distribution and the reasons why the wealth distribution is shaped in such a way in the US. I come to my last slide, and then I stop to explain even more what I mean between grand theory and explaining income distribution. So that is far more general than talking about Tony Atkinson. And I take the example of what has happened in advanced economies since post-Second World War. In many advanced economies, but not all, we can see a U-shaped pattern in income inequality, a U-shaped pattern that depends on the kind of inequality indicators that we use, but let's forget about it. And this U-shaped pattern is common to many countries, not all, but the timing, the magnitude, and the persistence of this pattern different. And why this? I think that this is the exemplification why there are common forces that may have affected all advanced economies, countries, advanced economies, like globalizations, like deindustrialization. So that is something in common with Kuznets' approach. But then once you have discussed these common forces that give long-run trend and to the income inequality changes, then we have to go much deeper into the country's circumstances and the policy choices that have led have led nations to have distinct national inequality patterns. And here what is crucial is the tax benefit system, because these are an example, and I'm going back to the distribution of these policy choices, but not only. So all regulation policies are relevant. Now it is common to discuss the pre-distribution. I would prefer to call it distribution of primary incomes, but regulation matters a lot. So to explain changes in inequality in modern societies, possibly in the past, but I'm less knowledgeable about the past. But in modern societies, you needed to go into the intricacies of all these different factors. And politics is something behind that, because changes in regulation of the labor market, for example, have much to do with politics and have much to do with what economists suggest. But the grand theories discussed by Branko sometimes are not helpful enough to understand what is happening and what is going to happen to our countries and to the inequality in our countries in the future. And I stop here, and thanks again for allowing me to discuss this beautiful book by Branko.
Thank you very much, Andrea. I'm asking, Branko, would you mind if we go further?
Yes.
And then you can respond to. So the next commentator is Éva Fodor, who is professor of gender studies and is currently a member of the CU's senior leadership team as prorector for teaching and learning. She has a PhD of sociology from the University of California. She's interested in how and why gender differences in the labor market and elsewhere are shaped, reshaped, and renegotiated and reproduced in different types of societies. Her recent book on gender regime and in anti-liberal Hungary describes the introduction of what she calls care-fair regime in Hungary after 2010. So the floor is yours, Éva.
Can I have my slides, please? We're going to change tack a bit. I'm a sociologist and not an economist, so I will be talking from the point of view of a sociologist. I'm also the only woman on this panel, and today is the International Day of Women. And I teach the Gender Studies department. And my research is mostly on gender inequality in the labor market. So all this combined, I felt it incumbent upon me to talk about something that's relevant. So happy International Women's Day. Have you already heard this? Maybe I should add that the International Women's Day, at least the myth is that this is in celebration, or initially in celebration of a strike organized by textile workers, women textile workers in New York, who were demanding higher wages, which was not altogether surprising because they made exactly 45% of men's wages. These are not those women, but already this is, so what I'm trying to say is that the International Women's Day is already about wage inequality, but, and wage distribution. I actually thought that the goal of the book is not just to describe wage distribution. Now you sort of kept talking about income distribution and wage distribution, but really the title of the book is Visions of Inequality. And indeed, the book and the authors in the book, not to mention your last chapter, is also about inequality, how sort of the shape of inequality in a society, classes, how classes are organized, the relationship of classes to each other, the opportunity structure that is that's different across classes. And my argument is going to be here that gender inequality is missing from these visions of inequality. And without thinking about gender inequality in the structure of society, in the structure of inequalities, we get a really crude and imprecise description of inequality, and our vision is somewhat blurred. Where am I supposed to be? There. So the reason why it's possible to ignore gender completely in a book on social inequalities is because of at least two assumptions. One, shared by most of the authors in the book. One is that classes are disembodied. So the people who fill classes are sort of gender neutral. It doesn't matter. Anybody can fill any class. Those people do not have bodies, do not have a bodily reality. And secondly, the second assumption is that the unit of analysis is households rather than individuals, and the focus is solely on households. This is a quote from the book. Let me just read the first sentence. Inequality is created and reproduced at the level of the household, not at the level of individual wage earners. And this is repeated. So it's not just that Branko emphasizes the household and pays attention to the household, but explicitly says that individual wage earners and the difference across individual wage earners doesn't matter. And the argument, of course, is that, and this is the 2 points that I highlighted here are important because here we see the reason why inequalities are important. And those are, at least for these 2 reasons, the fact that the class position is associated with specific social values and especially associated with different opportunities and that people and choices that people have in life. Okay. So my argument is that if we eliminate these 2 assumptions, we get rid of these 2 assumptions, and we get a more precise vision of the shape of social inequalities, and we can include gender differences in the story as well. Now, first I'm going to give you 3 reasons why these assumptions are leading us astray, and then I will suggest 2 very simple ways of fixing the problem. I'm going to talk about the increasing number of single-person households. I'm going to talk about this disembodied class business and how it does matter whether or not it's men or women who are members of a specific class. And then I'll talk about the notion of household and how that becomes problematic once we actually take women's work seriously. And I will be quick, and I promise that I'll be within the 10 minutes. So the first point is about the fact that even though these stories are about households, in fact, and not only households, but households where, in order to be able to ignore gender inequality, you need to have households where there's a man and a woman. Now, it turns out that fewer than half of the United States population, these are data from the US, live in such households, and a decreasing number. So more and more people live in single individual households. If we take single individual households into account, then, and we put them in hierarchies, then put these households in a hierarchy using wages, and soon we're going to notice that the households where there are women are at the bottom of the hierarchy. So that is kind of suspicious. That should give us pause, and that should make us wonder whether or not there's something else at play here other than forces of production, other than relations of production. So I think the fact that, while in the time of Adam Smith, maybe the focus on household made sense, nowadays it does less and less work. Right, and I also explained that women-only household tend to be at the bottom of the distribution. So clearly, we need to consider something that's outside of the story that we have heard up until now about relations to production. There are other forces at play that organize hierarchies, social inequalities. Okay, now these are my grandparents. Who got married exactly 100 years ago in the process of mating and household formation. I'm quoting you from that paragraph that I cited. I thought I would show you this because I want to argue that that belonging to the same class is an altogether different experience for men and women. I am sure I'm not going to say anything terribly new, but just thinking this through might help. So my grandmother, who was born in 1904, is 20 years old in this picture. She actually wanted to become a doctor, but she didn't because she was not, she couldn't study. This was not the time when it was actually easy. It was possible, but not easy for women to become doctors. So she has a secondary education. So instead, she married a doctor. My grandfather is a doctor. She was introduced to him through the family. So again, her choices she led a rather sort of secluded life in a solid middle-class family. Her father was my great-grandfather was a civil servant or a manager, a semi-manager, middle manager in a sugar factory near Budapest. So they lived an okay life near Budapest. And then she married a doctor and moved to Budapest. She had no income of her own, but got some pocket money and other household expenses from her husband. There was constant argument about that. She had very little impact on major family decisions. Specifically, major family argument was whether or not my grandfather should take a permanent job in a hospital that would secure a stable income for the family, or he should keep practicing at home, which was lucrative, but haphazard. She had to adjust to her husband's daily work. The whole family did. So she had very little choice in how she lived her daily life. And when they got divorced, which was actually quite rare, she had she was in her 50s. She had very little chance of remarriage, and she had very little chance of self-sufficiency. She actually ended up working as an assistant nurse and lived with one of her children. It would have been difficult to survive otherwise. Now, my grandfather, and I'm just not going to go through one by one, but was older than her a good 10 years. He's highly educated, a doctor with a private practice. He made all the decisions about money. Like I said, his decision about what kind of work he would be doing. The family's social life consisted of friends and colleagues who were his friends and his colleagues. And when, after divorce, he remarried within a few years, and, he kept being a doctor. So he kept being middle class. So the point I'm trying to make is that it's very obvious, if you think this through, that being middle class is a very different set of, a very different experience. It presents a very different set of opportunities, chances of action, level of control, level of authority, and a very different degree of risk for men and women. This was true in the 1900s. It's still true today. So when we talk about class, so the generalization of class, the capitalist class, the middle class, the aristocratic class, what the opportunity structure is for the people within is very important in order for us to understand social inequality, to have a vision of a true vision of social inequality. Okay, and the third point I want to make, a third reason why these assumptions should not be held onto, is that the value of women's work may materialize in the class status of other households. So what does that mean? We typically think of the class status of a household is determined by the wages and the resources that that household possesses. They come from members of the household who put their income and resources into the budget of that household, right? Except for the fact that women do a lot of unpaid care work. So raising children, looking after the elderly, organizing community lunches, etc. A lot of that work benefits people outside of the household. So for example, when my mother babysat my children, this allowed me to go to work. This allowed me to retain my middle-class status. In other words, her work, which she contributed to a different household, we lived in different households, increased my social status rather than hers. When somebody looks after an elderly relative, rather than allowing them to fall into poverty, then that person increases the social status, retains the social class status of that other household. Women's unpaid care work does that a lot. So in a situation like this, if this is the case, then I think we need to complicate our assumptions about independent households. We think of these as independent households. In fact, there's a lot of back and forth between households, not just across generation, but horizontally as well, which what makes me wonder whether or not how useful the concept of household is in and of itself. So I'm not trying to argue that we should completely get rid of the concept of looking at income distribution or wealth distribution within a household, but I'm arguing that that's not enough. We need to look deeper than the household. We need to look at individuals as well. Okay, and I'll be quick. So what to do about it? And this is to continue your optimistic trends for the future. You said that there are 3 trends, and I want to, which you just listed here. So I want to suggest 2 more that I think would be very important, would be particularly important in order to be able to integrate other types of inequalities into our vision of inequality in a meaningful way, in a way not to dilute, in a way to really explain those grand, to refine those grand theories and to refine the narrative that we have that's more immediate to what's going on. One is to add multidimensionality. The technical term here is intersectionality, which you might have encountered. And given our computational power that we have access now, a multidimensional vision of class is, of course, not beyond the realm of possibilities. So that's why I would argue to look at, household things at the level of the household, but also at the level of the individual. And once we include gender as a dimension, or there are lots of other dimensions, of course, that can be included, visualized, etc. Now, it has been maybe difficult to include data other than income in our calculations because of the very reason that was mentioned, which is that there's simply no data. Even income data is dubious before a certain point in time. But now, at the time, and this is the second point I'm trying to make, in the era of big data, we have new tools to assess the structure of opportunities, control over daily life, for example, and to be able to use those effectively in our models of inequality. So, for example, and this is just like a little idea, and I know that some people are already doing this. These are all pictures of women in the 1950s, which I collected from the internet randomly. Using a computer, we could generate ideas about what are the life opportunities, what kind of people women are associated with, what kind of activities do they do, how restrictive clothing do they wear. All of those would highlight the kinds of inequalities that are connected to income inequalities, but also have an independent force on the shape of social inequalities and would complicate our visions of inequality and visions of class. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eva. And now we move immediately to Brian Nolan, who is a professor of social policy at the Department of Social Policy and Intervention, and director of Employment Equity and Growth Program of INET. And he's a senior research fellow at Nuffield College. He's an economist by training with doctorate from the LSE. And his main areas of research are income inequality, poverty, economics and social policy. He's been authoring a number of books like chapters in, or editing a handbook of economic inequality, chapters in changing inequalities in rich countries, analytical and comparative perspectives, and children in austerity, the impact of the Great Recession and child poverty in rich countries. Some of these we've been co-authoring or co-editing with Brian, and so I have to tell that it was always a very easygoing. It was always joy, and it was always very efficient to work together. So I expect that we will receive very insightful comments. Brian, it's yours now, the floor.
Thank you very much, István, and thank you very much for the opportunity to join this very interesting discussion on a fascinating book. in the interest of time, I'm going to make my points verbally rather than through the slides that I could be showing you. But looking at the time, I think I'm going to be prioritizing being quick. Greatly enjoyed and learned from reading the book. I guess I'd make a couple of points about the way it deals with the material, first of all. And one is that we go straight from Ricardo through what could be considered outliers in terms of mainstream economics, Marx and Pareto, all the way to Kuznets. And quite a lot is assumed or left unsaid about the development of neoclassical economics and how we got from Ricardo to DSG modeling. And I think while that wasn't to be the focus of the book, it's sort of the dog that doesn't bark is the very limited role that thinking about inequality plays in mainstream economics right through the neoclassical period and up to the period that Branko characterizes as the eclipse. So I think maybe quite a lot is being assumed there, if you like, in terms of knowledge, and in some sense, explaining why the dog doesn't bark is almost as interesting as concentrating on the very limited number of barking dogs, if I can overuse that metaphor. Turning to the framing, I think Branko very helpfully and correctly places a lot of emphasis on the shift from thinking about or presenting and analyzing in terms of economic classes to thinking about and ranking in terms of either income or a broader income and wealth type of concept. That shift has been fundamental, and the role he brings out very well, the role that Pareto played in that shift, which was it certainly added to my knowledge. I think one thing that we come away from the book perhaps thinking about and relating to what Éva was just saying is how much is obscured as well as how much is revealed by starting from a ranking that is in terms of income or indeed wealth, and in some sense letting class drop out of the picture as well as what happens within households. My comments don't relate to the discussion of Smith and Marx that Branko concentrated his own input on. Instead, and either helpfully or unhelpfully, they concentrate on what he has to say about disappearing inequality and why inequality went into what he calls an eclipse over a lengthy period in the second half of the 20th century. Now, I guess just say a couple of things about this. It isn't obvious to me when the eclipse is regarded as having happened, and relative to what. When was inequality playing a much more substantial role in mainstream economic analysis and thinking? What are we framing the eclipse against? And in terms of the factors that he sees as underpinning that eclipse, which, as he mentioned, the politically motivated need to minimize the importance of economic class, the theoretic turn in neoclassical economics, and the funding of research by the rich. These are the factors seen as driving the eclipse. I don't get a sense of how we're to assess the role they played and their relative importance in driving that eclipse. And in fact, I'm not even sure that I can think through how we would go about making such an assessment. So the plausibility of these as relevant factors is not questioned. I wouldn't question it, but how we're meant to assess just how important they were relative to other factors and each other is I think pretty challenging. And one particularly interesting issue, of course, for an economist is what drove the turn in neoclassical economics towards more and more technical, theoretical, and very specific theoretical framings. And how are we to relate that to what was happening in the outside world and the sort of factors he mentions? I think that's a hard nut to crack. And maybe we have to think about the role of the economic context even more centrally. He does, of course, mention it, but this was, of course, a period when inequality was declining, the labor share was rising, and real incomes and living standards were improving. So to what extent do we have to go much further than that to think about why interest in inequality might have gone into the background? During the eclipse, I would absolutely agree with what Andrea said about the research that was going on, let's say during the 80s and 90s, about inequality, and the extent to which much of that is characterized as mere empirics. I think, certainly in the case of Tony Atkinson, which I think is a complete mischaracterization, to be honest. But more generally, I think the treatment here in the book underestimates the extent to which the interest in getting the numbers right was driven by wanting to unpack and reveal the underlying causal processes. And this, of course, is true of Branko's own work, which he characterizes during the period as, to an extent, mere empirics as well. He's not doing himself justice, but he's not doing justice to many others as well, I think. And also, I would very much reinforce what Andrea said about what I think is a mischaracterization of the interest in episodes of inequality increase and trying to understand specific periods during which we observe or can find out that inequality increased, as opposed to a grand narrative, big picture, which can often miss as much as it obscure as much as it reveals. Very briefly, to talk about why there has been a resurgence in interest in inequality research more recently. I guess again, and this is an addendum to the book, but I think it's something that is obviously of central interest to us as we think about the whole theme of the book. So from when would we date a resurgence in interest in inequality? I think here it's very hard to get away from the dominance of US concerns, US experiences, and US academic fashions in driving what we then take to be a more global phenomenon. And I think this certainly merits a lot of unpacking. So there's a lot of emphasis on the extent to which capital is back. And of course, Thomas Piketty has played a central role there. But I think we have to remember, and this again relates to some of what Éva was emphasizing, we have to remember that earnings are still absolutely central for most households, and understanding the evolution of real wages and the distribution of earnings across individuals and households is still a central task for inequality research. So while I absolutely share Branko's admiration of Thomas Piketty's impact and the theoretical framework he develops, I wouldn't be as sure as Branko is that this is going to turn out to be the fundamental contribution to inequality research that it could be and may turn out to be, but I think the jury is still out on it. It isn't obvious to me how much follow-through there has been or will be in terms of embracing this theoretical framework. And that goes back again to the point that Andrea was questioning, and I would question, as to the centrality of the sort of grand theoretical treatment and framing and narrative that Branko is so keen to see, whether that is actually the most important thing that we should be looking to see. And indeed, one could say that Piketty's contribution in terms of establishing the empirical facts has been at least as influential as the theoretical contribution so far. So I think the fundamental challenge we face, again, reflecting on the grand narrative, on the grand theoretical, what Branko is looking for in those terms, clearly, and is brought out in the quote from that Andrea had, if we think about not wealth but income inequality, an integrated theory of inequality has to combine an understanding of individual level wages, how they combine with income from capital, from pensions, from social transfers, and how individual recipients with different income packages cluster into households, what affects that, and how they then separately and jointly behave. So this is a tall order. That is the fundamental challenge. And again, it isn't obvious to me that one grand framework is going to successfully encompass all the very complicated causal processes involved. So I think that's where I would leave my input and look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brian. Now I just would like to make a little add. The book looks like that. Okay. Can you stream also? Okay, so the book looks that, and Tarki invites you for a 25% discount if you want to buy it, because we agreed with the booksellers workshop, which is just around the corner. So all those who receive the link from me, for those who register, they will be, they will be getting a 25% discount. I think it's better now to give the word to Branko, and then we will open the floor for some questions.
Well, first, thanks a lot to the really excellent comments that I've received. I've written them down, so they are not going to be lost. And for the sake of still having some time for discussion, maybe we can also add a few extra minutes because we lost in the beginning. And I will also, for the sake of time, will not answer individual individual commentators. So let me just make two broad points which actually encompass comments and critiques from, I think, all three commentators. The first one is really the tension or maybe disagreement between the need for what I call integrative study, which means it is actually what Brian called grand theory. It is not exactly the same because that grand theory needs to include also empirics, versus the episodes. I think there is a philosophical difference. I believe that if we really limit ourselves to the explanation of episodes, we will never get very far. The episodes are very diverse. They are really diverse in time, diverse in countries, and this is good for individual studies, but we cannot depend only on episodes. That's a philosophical difference. The second philosophical difference is a point that was raised by Eva, primarily, but also by Andrea and by Brian, is really at what level does inequality matter? In other words, the reason why I use the households, well, first of all, I'm describing what the authors have written. So they have not written about gender economics. And actually, I mentioned that they have actually also ignored race. A largely ignored race. So I cannot now sort of starting imputing things which are not there. But also, importantly, I think that actually at the current time, I think that the values which actually then are being reproduced are really household values. No, the household can consist of one person, absolutely right, and that's the point that they were made. And I'm totally also in favor of studies of wage distribution, but I call them in the book in the last chapter incidental studies in the sense that they do not address the social reproduction in the same way that the households, whether they are single households, multiple members or whatever, do. So there is this tension there that as I said, I mentioned one reason is that because the authors do not discuss it. The second thing is where the reproduction of inequality takes place. And a final point, which is also mentioned by the commentators, but maybe in particular by Andrea in this case, is normative part. I explicitly said, as Andrea actually acknowledged, that the normative part, normative authors that are really based on normative essentially are excluded. They are not discussed in my book. There is actually another book which happened to be written at the same time by on political philosophy by a historian, Darrell McMahon, which actually does exactly the opposite. It starts with Judeo-Christian sort of approach to inequality, goes through Plato and Aristotle, and brings us all to the present identity politics. It's, I think, and we actually overlap in Smith and Marx. And but the authors like Sen, Rawls, Hayek, Rousseau would have been in the book had I really been concerned with normative. But for the others, yes, the normative does appear. Andrea is right when he quotes me in contradiction, but it's not a contradiction, I believe. It's simply that the normative part, obviously for Marx mattered for Pareto, so I have to acknowledge that. But they were not essentially normative thinkers. Actually, Marx, when he looks at income inequality under capitalism, displays very little interest for that because the abolition of classes is primarily the primary aim in capitalism, not reduction of inequality. So let me stop here. And again, thank you very much to everybody. Thank you to Andrea. Thank you to Eva. And thank you to Brian. Excellent comments. I, of course, have written them down, and I might actually think of, well, maybe in another revision doing it, but the interesting idea which came to my mind with Weber speaking, actually writing a chapter on gender, personal gender relations with the 5 authors, like the book that who cooked Adam Smith's dinner, I believe, or what was the, they all had a fairly, how should I say, interesting relationship in that respect. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Branko. And now I think we can open the discussion. Oh, no. Is there anyone from the commentators who would like to respond back? Do you see it, Abel? No? Okay. Then I suggest that we open the floor for comments, online or offline as well. Can I ask my colleagues to warn me if there is one from the online? Okay, from here, from the room? Actually, I have many, but I'd like to wait. Okay, I have, as I said, many, but I will first express my appreciation for the book and for the presentation as well. Two things. You said that in the eclipse period, there were 3 reasons why there was not extensive study of inequalities, and one of them was that because it's the rich who would have financed, perhaps. Now I see that now there is plenty of funding on inequality, actually very much concentrated in certain parts, in a few parts of the world, all funded by the rich. What happened? I mean, if you could explore something on that. The second is that I know that if you list 6 authors as the great thinkers of inequality, and there should be always choices made who is in and who is out. And I know that Samir Amin was mentioned in various places, but I would like to raise another name, and I would like to hear your opinion about that. So I think that what Tinbergen did, Jan Tinbergen, was to some extent a path-breaking thing. I mean, he raised the issue of the race between technology and education, and from that, a complete, branch of economics has been derived, and the most recent Nobel laureate Claudia Goodin also is in that that stream, I mean, the role of education and the role of the change of the technological platforms, which are very important. And I think that Tim Bergen's contribution fulfills all those three, but I may be mistaken, all those three criteria. There is empirics there is theory there, and there is some narrative there, or maybe not in Tim Bergen's word, but the followers or those who came after that. So I would like to hear your opinion about that. I mean, I read in another books of you put a more prominent place for Tim Bergen. So that's the two, and I have many more.
Okay, let me try to briefly answer that. Let me start with the second question, because to some extent it is also related to the points that Andrea made and also Brian. The choice of the authors is not driven by who are the most important authors in income distribution. It's really driven first by subjective view, I mean, authors that I liked and I read, but it's also by big authors in economics. And I disagree with Brian that Marx can be considered a sort of an incidental author. I mean, if Marx's influence is enormous. So I would rather say that actually people like John Stuart Mill are incidental authors. So I do think that there is a link, and that's very clear in the book. Even a link between Pareto, and actually Brian said Pareto is also a sort of secondary author, but the link between Pareto, each of them is very clear. Quesnay and Smith actually are the only two authors who met each other. Then Ricardo starts being interested in political economy through reading of The Wealth of Nations. Marx is totally dependent on Ricardo. As Schumpeter says, the only author who can be considered to have been a teacher to Marx was Ricardo. And Pareto starts writing Le Système Socialiste in reaction to Marx. So there is a very clear line there. And the only one which doesn't have that clear link is Kuznets. But as I said, I think Kuznets is with Keynes the most important economist in the 20th century, because his contribution was both in national accounts and in income distribution. In other words, in the first and the second moment of the distribution. Now, who could have been, yeah, I actually considered, Tim Bergen is mentioned there, but maybe I was a little bit, and I agree with István that he could actually be said. He had the empirical part, he had a theoretical part, and he had the narrative. I agree with that. I was just a little bit, how should I say, I thought that the emphasis on wages alone was not sufficient. So let me put it like that. And the person, as I mentioned, who actually, despite what he was not mentioned by anybody here, is Samir Amin. And I think the important part is that for the first time with dependencia theorists and structuralists, we see the global forces shaping income distribution in the country. You don't have that with any of the authors that I discussed. Suddenly, that was actually, in my opinion, the biggest contribution. And I have to say, for me, it is a bigger contribution than going through a myriad of data points in the 70s and 80s, distinguishing small details here and there, versus a real and important claim, which is also based on world system theory, that income distribution in the country may be reflecting the global forces. So that was for the choice of the authors. But of course, everybody is free to have a different opinion about the evolution of economics and the important authors. Now, why the rich are now funding? That's a very good question. I was already asked. The only answer that I can give sort of plausible is that there was a change in the intellectual climate. That change, and I intentionally don't discuss Piketty, but that change was actually brought by Piketty. And there was a change in intellectual climate in the United States, and there was now suddenly funding by the rich, but more importantly, willingness of young people to do dissertation and studies and use the data, which are really plentiful. Because 20 years ago, that was not the case. The best economists would run away from income distribution. They would say, well, this is really for, people who are interested in social issues. It is not really hard. I want to study financial economics and macroeconomics. That has changed. So there was a different ideological climate now compared to 20 years ago. And actually the book, as you know, stops at the 1990 intentional.
Still here, sorry.
Yeah, I was
Just one more.
Yes,
One
yes,
more.
go ahead.
If you compare the US and Europe, what differences you think in that respect and the climate of the research and income distribution? I think there has been also a change.
Well, there was a change, but I think it also for the eclipse, the role of the United States is important because, as I said, the gravity of economic work moved there. And it is true that ideologically, classes or inequality were really not considered as obvious or acceptable as in Europe. And that's why I say, actually, why do we have Latin America, in my opinion, as the only part of the world without the eclipse? Because inequality was so obvious, you could not be in Latin America and not see inequality. And secondly, they were not involved in the Cold War to the extent that Europe and the US were. So there is more, if you will, intellectual freedom. And that's why they created, I think, structuralism and the dependency.
I think it's better if you stay here. And
yeah, I'll stay, and then there is a question. Yeah, you have to come here, yeah.
Thank you. So my question would be that in the last part, you mentioned a lot of reasons why economists hasn't worked on income inequalities questions, and cannot be the reason that division of labor, division of disciplines got stronger, and it is a normal process in capitalism because partly it makes more efficient work. For instance, you mentioned Tony Atkinson. Maybe he could have created more thorough theories and normative approaches if he couldn't spend his whole life creating very quality data. So now we have much better data because people spend their life creating better data. Yeah, and yeah, of course, this kind of division of disciplines is partly artificial, as structuralists argue, but I think it is a natural process of capitalism.
Well, I agree, actually, and it's a good point that you mentioned. Maybe the people who have worked on data and created data, they have made it possible for others to create, integrative studies. I agree with that. I just sort of thought, as you were saying, how that natural process leads to the division of labor. I was just thinking of what Adam Smith said. If we really divide it in such fragmented way, we basically lose overall picture. And I would also like to say that I think that Andrea did not really truthfully reflect my view on Tony Atkinson, of whom I'm actually a big admirer. And in that part of the book, yes, Tony is criticized indirectly because of these episodes and emphasis on data without really connection to politics. And it is true, when you read Tony's work, there is really very little behind these numbers, like where there are no strikes, there are no demonstrations, there are no changes in government and so forth. But he also has contributed enormously, and especially, as I mentioned, that in the latter part of his life, when he said actually bringing income inequality back from the cold, and also brings the capital, which I think is very important development, bringing in capital, which it is overrepresented obviously in incomes of the rich, and which contributes very significantly to inequality. And Tony was somebody who brought this back. So I just wanted to be clear clearer on this part.
Okay.
Maybe the commentators will say something.
Maybe Andrea, you would like to respond? Brian?
Just very briefly.
Yeah. Sorry, Brian Nolan.
just very briefly, I think this is an important point that I wanted to bring out in the comments I made about the emphasis that Branko puts on bringing politics into the picture. And I guess it's an interesting reflection as to why many economists steer clear of this. And perhaps because it's not always professionally rewarding, but also the extent to which there is again a division of labor, where, you know, at what point do economists stop and hand over the baton to the political scientists, and how much is it an obligation on those trying to understand income inequality or wealth inequality to bring the politics into the picture directly themselves, as opposed to relate what they're doing to those who are devoting their attention fully to studying the politics of it. I think that's an open question, and I wouldn't be as prescriptive as Branko is in terms of where that dividing line is. And just on a detail, but an important one, I didn't say Marx was incidental. I said he was an outlier in terms of the development of mainstream economics and how we got to where economics now is in Western universities. Nobody could think of regarding him as incidental, and I didn't.
And maybe I forgot exactly the term that you used, but on the division between politics and economics, I think it's obviously an interesting point. It's also again a philosophical point. I think very often when I wrote that chapter 7, I thought of the expression. We will see the application of that. When Solidarność came in Poland, they called themselves self-limiting revolution because they knew how far they could go, so they thought we are self-limiting revolution. Actually, in the 1970s and the 80s, empirical economists, including myself, were self-limiting because we essentially said, okay, we would study the numbers, we will study the episodes, we would write, we will collect the data, all of that. I think it was a wrong decision. I think that political aspects is inseparable with inequality and explains inequality, and we should have been bolder.
Thank you very much. I think since we are reaching the time slot, what we allocated, we've been allocated for this. If there are no urgent other,
or maybe some questions from the, if there is anything from the audience, I mean from, no. But we were very persuasive.
You see. So I think I first ask you if you want to say any closing remarks.
No, I'm actually just wanted to thank you again for the attention. Actually, I really appreciated the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. And again, thank you to Eva, thank you to Andrea, and thank you to Brian.
Okay. Eva, Brian, and Andrea, do you want to say something at the end? Eva, not? Okay, then I would like to thank Professor Milanovic for writing the book and for making this presentation. I would like to thank also the 3 commentators for reading it and commenting it in detail. And I also would like to thank for the participation of the online and the offline audience. I think we learned a lot, and this is exactly the purpose of our work in progress series, in which you have seen this discussion. And yeah, thanks again. And I think we can give a huge appreciation.